What if I told you that Adolf Hitler didn't just lead a nation? He rewired its mind. He didn't use magic. He didn't need to. He used rhythm, symbols, fear, repetition, pain, and something far more dangerous than bombs: belief. Ordinary people, teachers, farmers, nurses, artists, in just a few years, they weren't thinking for themselves anymore. They were thinking as him, marching in his rhythm, chanting his words, fighting his enemies, committing crimes they once couldn't imagine, not because they were forced to, but because something inside them had been switched. This wasn't just propaganda. It was psychological warfare. Every speech was a trigger, every rally a ritual, every sacrifice a chain. Hitler understood how to bypass logic and go straight to the nervous system, how to use fear to erase thought and loyalty to blind the soul. And the terrifying part, the same psychological blueprints still exist. Politicians still use them. Corporations still study them. Algorithms still trigger them. You've already seen it, maybe even felt it, without realizing. Before we go any further, answer this honestly in the comments. Do you believe mass mind control is still happening today? Or do you think we've outgrown it? The summer heat pressed down on the Nuremberg rally grounds in September 1934. As Adolf Hitler stepped to the podium, a strange silence fell over the crowd of nearly 1 million people. Then he began speaking in that peculiar cadence that would become the soundtrack to Germany's nightmare. What those listeners didn't know was that every pause, every shout, every whisper had been scientifically designed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to their nervous systems. Modern analysis of Hitler's speech patterns reveals a disturbing precision. His delivery consistently fell between 120 and 160 words per minute, the exact rhythm of a resting human heartbeat. This was no accident. Neurologists now understand that when speech patterns match our biological rhythms, they create a trance-like state of suggestibility. The effect is primal, dating back to when early humans bonded through rhythmic chanting around fires. Hitler intuitively understood this ancient wiring and weaponized it. The construction of his speeches followed careful psychological engineering. Opening remarks would start slow and quiet, forcing crowds to strain forward. Just as attention wavered, he'd explode into sudden shouts that triggered the mammalian startle reflex. This alternating pattern of tension and release kept audiences in a constant state of heightened emotional arousal. Speech transcripts show he repeated simple phrases like blood and soil or Jewish conspiracy exactly 3 times, the number needed for subconscious retention according to Nazi psychological research. Perhaps most disturbingly, Hitler's team secretly studied audience reactions using hidden cameras. They discovered that certain gestures triggered specific responses. The downward palm chop motion activated primitive submission instincts. Pointing directly at the crowd made individuals feel personally accused. Extended pauses after key phrases allowed the words to echo in listeners' minds. These techniques were refined over hundreds of speeches until they became perfect psychological weapons. The effects were measurable. Police reports from early rallies noted normally reasonable citizens screaming for violence after just 30 minutes of exposure. Diaries from the period describe housewives who couldn't explain their sudden hatreds, only that they felt it in their bones after hearing Hitler speak. Even his political opponents admitted feeling strangely compelled by his rhythm before catching themselves. Contemporary brain scan technology helps explain why. Functional MRI studies show that rhythmic speech at this cadence decreases activity in the prefrontal cortex, while lighting up the amygdala and basal ganglia. In simple terms, it turns off critical thinking and turns on emotional response. Modern political speakers unconsciously mimic these patterns, though rarely with such precision. The aftermath of these speeches revealed their terrifying effectiveness. Normal social restraints collapsed as neighbors denounced neighbors. Ordinary Germans participated in atrocities they'd never previously contemplated. When questioned later, many could only say it seemed right at the time, unable to articulate why they'd abandoned lifelong morals. This neurological hijacking didn't stay in the 1930s. Today's social media algorithms employ similar principles through infinite scroll features and notification pulses that create addictive rhythms. Certain politicians consciously imitate Hitler's cadence, though they'd never admit it. The science of attention engineering has become more sophisticated, but the biological vulnerabilities remain unchanged. Defending against such manipulation starts with recognition. When you feel your pulse sensing to a speaker's rhythm, when repeated phrases start feeling true through familiarity alone, when reason gives way to pure emotion, that's the moment to step back. History shows these techniques work best when unrecognized. The final irony is that Hitler's own psychologists warned him about these methods in 1935. Secret memos from the Reich Ministry of Science cautioned that rhythmic propaganda could damage critical thinking capacity. His response was to classify the research and expand its use. The very tools that built his power ultimately destroyed the society he sought to control. This dark chapter in psychological history serves as both warning and lesson. The human mind remains vulnerable to those who understand its rhythms. As technology makes these techniques more precise, our only defense is awareness of how easily biology can override reason when skillfully manipulated. The Nuremberg rallies proved that civilization is thinner than we imagine. It takes just the right rhythm, the right repetition, the right emotional triggers to make ordinary people abandon everything they thought they believed. That danger hasn't disappeared. It's just taken new forms. Recognizing the pattern may be our only protection against history repeating. The true horror of Nazi Germany did not begin with concentration camps or mass executions. It began with something far more subtle yet infinitely more dangerous: the systematic reprogramming of how an entire population perceived reality. Hitler's most devastating weapon was not his military might, but his psychological insight into how to manufacture enemies that existed only in the collective imagination. This was not simple demonization. It was the creation of a psychological phantom, a shadow enemy designed to be both laughably weak and terrifyingly powerful at the same time. The Nazi propaganda machine operated with clinical precision to construct this impossible contradiction. On one hand, Jewish people were depicted as subhuman creatures, drawn in posters and films with exaggerated features, poor hygiene, and animalistic behaviors. These images targeted the primal disgust response hardwired into every human brain. Simultaneously, other propaganda materials showed Jewish people as brilliant puppet masters controlling global finance, media, and governments through secret networks. This triggered the deep-seated fear of invisible threats.
This dual portrayal was not accidental. Secret documents from Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry reveal explicit instructions to artists and writers. One memorandum ordered cartoonists to alternate between depicting Jews as filthy beggars and powerful bankers. Another directive required newsreels to show elderly Jewish shopkeepers as pathetic one moment, then cut to shadowy figures manipulating stock markets the next. The goal was never logical consistency, but psychological overwhelm. The science behind this tactic explains its terrifying effectiveness. Modern neurology shows that disgust and fear activate different, but equally powerful brain circuits. Disgust originates in the insular cortex, triggering avoidance behaviors. Fear lights up the amygdala, preparing the body for fight or flight. When these two systems are activated alternately, they create what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a state of mental stress that the brain desperately tries to resolve. Nazi propaganda exploited this by providing a simple resolution: complete trust in Hitler's leadership as the only solution. The implementation followed careful stages. First came the dehumanization phase. Medical journals published fake studies about Jewish physical inferiority. Children's books contain stories comparing Jewish people to disease-carrying animals. This eroded natural empathy by attacking the basic recognition of shared humanity. Next came the conspiracy narratives. Fabricated documents, like the protocols of the Elders of Zion, were mass-printed despite being repeatedly debunked. The Nazis didn't need them to be credible, only pervasive. Like modern viral misinformation, repetition replaced verification. Finally came the crisis construction. Each real problem, economic troubles, social unrest, was framed as proof of the imaginary Jewish threat. This created a self-sealing argument where even contradictory evidence reinforced the illusion. If Jews were poor, it proved their inferiority. If successful, it proved their conspiracy. The psychological impact was devastating. Ordinary Germans found themselves trapped in what psychologists now call double-bind thinking. To question the Jewish threat meant denying visible proofs of their supposed weakness. To accept it meant believing in their impossible power. Caught between these contradictions, many surrendered their critical faculties entirely. Contemporary examples show this tactic remains dangerously effective. Immigrants portrayed as both lazy burdens and job thieves. Political opponents framed as both bumbling fools and criminal masterminds. The pattern persists because it exploits fundamental weaknesses in human cognition. Modern research from Yale and Cambridge universities confirms the lasting power of this approach. Studies show that exposure to contradictory but emotionally charged characterizations of any group reduces critical thinking capacity by over 70%. The brain, overwhelmed by conflicting emotional stimuli, defaults to the path of least resistance, uncritical acceptance. Defense against such psychological warfare requires conscious effort. The first step is pattern recognition. When a group is simultaneously described as incompetent and omnipotent, when social problems are blamed on a single faction while ignoring systemic causes, when language oscillates between pity and panic, these are the warning signs of manufactured enemies. Historical records from Nazi Germany reveal an uncomfortable truth. Many citizens who participated in atrocities were not psychopaths, but ordinary people whose perception of reality had been systematically distorted. Their diaries often express confusion about how they came to believe things they once would have found absurd. This psychological vulnerability is not a relic of the past. As technology enables more sophisticated micro-targeting of individual fears and prejudices, the danger grows more acute. Social media algorithms unconsciously replicate Goebbels' tactics by showing users increasingly extreme versions of their existing biases. The ultimate purpose of these enemy illusions remains constant throughout history. They serve to concentrate power by presenting the leader as the only solution to an invented crisis. Hitler didn't simply want Germans to hate Jews. He needed them to feel so threatened by imaginary dangers that they would surrender all judgment to his authority. This dark chapter in psychological history offers crucial lessons for the present. The human mind remains vulnerable to those who understand how to manipulate its fears and contradictions. As the tools of propaganda grow more advanced, our only defense is awareness of these patterns and the courage to question emotional certainties. The real enemy was never the imaginary threat, but the willingness to believe in simple answers to complex problems. That temptation persists in every generation, waiting for new opportunists to exploit it. Recognizing this is the first step toward breaking the cycle. They came back bloodied, bruised, with swollen eyes and torn shirts. But they didn't complain. They smiled. They held their injuries like medals. For Adolf Hitler, this was not collateral damage. It was the point from the earliest days of the Nazi movement. Violence was not just accepted, it was orchestrated. Hitler understood that loyalty born from comfort is weak. Real devotion, the kind that turns men into zealots, must be earned through pain. And so, he made sure they bled for him. His brown shirts, the SA, were not just street thugs. They were instruments of psychological transformation. They were ordered into enemy territory, pushed into confrontation with communists, police, anyone who would fight back. When they were injured, it wasn't seen as a tactical failure. It was a success, a recruitment tool, a ritual. Hitler knew that a man who loses a tooth for a cause will spend the rest of his life defending that cause, because to admit otherwise would be to admit his pain was pointless, and the human mind refuses to believe its suffering was in vain. He called them heroes. He stood over hospital beds and whispered promises of destiny. Rallies were stopped to name the wounded. Torchlit marches carried the coffins of the fallen like holy relics. Their names were repeated like sacred verses, their faces printed on posters, their stories rewritten into myth. In 1930, when a young SA man named Horst Wessel was killed in a petty dispute, Hitler's propaganda machine transformed him into a martyr of the movement. His funeral became a national spectacle. His poem was turned into an anthem, and with that, A new religion was born. This wasn't politics. This was pain converted into purpose. The deeper the sacrifice, the deeper the loyalty. When men were beaten in the streets, fired from jobs, disowned by family, they didn't retreat. They believed more, because now they had something to lose. Now they needed it to be true. Hitler never asked them to win arguments. He asked them to suffer. And then he told them their suffering made them holy. Modern psychology calls this the sunk cost fallacy. But to Hitler, it was prophecy. He spoke of struggle not as a phase, but as a way of life. He told Germans they were victims, that their suffering was sacred, that their blood would fertilize the soil of rebirth. And when blood was actually spilled, he smiled, because now they were trapped. Pain binds. Every punch thrown at them, every insult hurled, every law passed to stop them, it all fed the fire. They became addicted to their own persecution. It gave them meaning. It made them feel alive. And most of all, it made them feel chosen. Hitler's speeches didn't hide this. He embraced it. He told crowds that the more they suffered, the more righteous they were. He called them soldiers of fate. He told them the world hated them because they dared to speak the truth, and they believed it. Every bruise was proof. Every enemy was validation. And so, the movement grew. Not in peace, but in agony. Not in comfort, but in wounds. Because Hitler knew that nothing binds a group tighter than shared pain. Soldiers know it. Cults know it. Revolutionaries know it. And so did he. By the time the Nazis came to power, their followers weren't just loyal. They were emotionally chained. To leave the movement now would be to admit they had suffered for nothing. To question it would be to spit on their own scars. And so they doubled down, again and again.
Even when the lies grew darker, even when the violence became genocide, they stayed, because they had already paid, and the cost was too high to turn back. What started as a political strategy had become a psychological prison. Across Germany, mothers cried tears of pride when their sons returned from street fights. Teachers whispered slogans instead of lessons. Neighbors who once shared bread now shared secrets with the Gestapo. The nation had become a cult of sacrifice, and the more people bled, the more they believed. The worst part is, it worked. Hitler didn't need to win every argument. He just needed his followers to suffer enough that they would never walk away. Pain was the hook, and belief was the chain. Today, the same pattern repeats itself in cults, in extremist groups, in radical movements around the world. They all begin the same way. First, create a sense of threat. Then, provoke the enemy. When the backlash comes, frame it as proof. Make the follower pay a price. And once they do, give them a reason to defend the very thing that wounded them. It's a cycle. Pain, loyalty, belief, more pain. And the more someone gives, the less they can afford to doubt. Because doubt would mean it was all for nothing. That's the trap. In modern times, it happens online too. A person joins a controversial group, posts something extreme, gets banned, mocked, attacked. Then the group says, see, they hate you because you're right. That rejection becomes proof. That backlash becomes validation. And suddenly, they're not just following a belief, they're defending their own emotional investment. Hitler was a master of this. He didn't just manipulate minds. He manipulated wounds. He found pain and turned it into armor. And then, he sent his followers into battle wearing that armor, thinking it made them invincible. But it did in single quotes it made them blind. Blind to reason, blind to humanity, blind to everything except the idea that their suffering must have meaning, that their struggle must be noble, because the alternative was unbearable. By the time the war ended, millions of Germans looked around and couldn't recognize what they had become. Cities were in ruins, families torn apart. The right they had bled for lay in ashes, and still, some believed, because they had suffered too much to admit they had been deceived. Their pain had become their prison, and the world learned, or should have learned, that the most dangerous leaders are not the ones who offer hope. They are the ones who offer pain, and then tell you it matters. Because once you believe your suffering is sacred, you'll do anything to protect it, even if it means burning the world around you. That was Hitler's genius. That was his curse, and it hasn't gone away. We like to think we're smarter. Now, that propaganda can't fool us. that we would see it coming. But the truth is, the techniques haven't changed. The rhythm of the words, the enemy illusions, the sacrifice traps, the way pain is turned into purpose, it's all still here, just hidden behind new slogans, new flags, new screens. So ask yourself this. Have you ever believed something just because everyone else did? Have you ever felt hatred that didn't belong to you? Have you ever defended a cause, not because it was right, but because you'd already paid for it with your time, your energy, your pride? That's how it starts. Hitler may be dead, but his methods are not. They're alive, they're working, and if we don't recognize them, we will fall for them again. Let me know what part of this documentary hit you the hardest. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, stay awake.